Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University with their monthly contributions of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am very excited to be celebrating the third anniversary of the Catholic Theology Show. So this is a special anniversary edition that we're going to do. I have a friend, colleague, frequent guest, Dr. Roger Nutt, on the show. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me back on the show, and congratulations. It's hard to imagine. I was on a number of the very early episodes, and it's been so fun to watch the podcast grow and flourish, and it seems astonishing that it's been 3 years already.
Yeah, we launched it on October 22nd, 2022. Wow, believe it or not, yeah, 2022. It was on October 22nd is the feast of John Paul II. And John Paul II really is is just a saint in so many ways that has impacted so much. You know, we both you converted to the Catholic Church when he was Pope, and I returned to the church I was confirmed in 1994, 31 years ago. And it's just great to see his call for the new evangelization, but also the idea that the new evangelization of representing the gospel to places that had earlier received it, right? This is re-evangelizing the West, but his emphasis that the evangelical works of the church, the great catechesis that in a way that the church needs to carry out, has to be rooted in theology, right? That theology matters. I think that has been so central really to his life, and it's hopefully been at least, I think, one of the things that's really inspired our work with the Catholic Theology Show.
I agree. And our work with the university, you were very much an architect in the founding of the university and even the university's mission statement and curriculum. So you're very familiar with John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and certainly his encyclical letter Fides et Ratio. And as I enjoy the Catholic Theology Show, I see the emphasis in John Paul II's thought on truth reverberate through your work, that the Catholic University is dedicated. John Paul II said it's honor and responsibility of the Catholic University to serve the cause of the truth. And I think that that is a way in which people might not appreciate how theology really matters. Theology gives us the fullest and most integrated vision of reality. And your show has had so many different guests with so many different types of topics that are covered, and I kind of see it as a microcosm of this vision of the fullness of truth.
You know, one of my favorite quotes, when people ask me to give a little 5-minute talk about what's the Catholic Theology Show, what does it matter, why are you doing it, I often will include as somebody I believe converted to Catholicism at the end of his life, John Wayne, who was a great Western actor in the 20th century. But at one time, he was quoted as saying that life is hard, but it's harder if you're stupid, right? And I always kind of say that. And I said, life is hard, and it's harder if you have stupid ideas about God, right? It's harder if you have bad ideas about God. C.S. Lewis, in his Mere Christianity, in Book 4, when he actually is going through kind of dense theological work of the creeds in Mere Christianity, which he delivered on the British Broadcasting company, the BBC, during the war, in little 10, 15-minute fireside broadcast chats to help encourage a nation in the midst of war. He starts going through the creed. And he says a lot of people have warned him not to do this. Right. He says people don't want theology. They don't want creedal stuff. What they want is just encouragement. And he said, that's basically foolishness. Because he says the problem is today, if we don't have good ideas about God, it's not that we have no ideas about God, it's that we have bad ideas about God. And most often we have false ideas about God that have been tried out by the church and rejected. They've been tried out by Christians, by the best Christians, by the saints and our tradition, in some ways by Jesus Christ himself, and they've been rejected, right? So you think about it in some ways, just to put it in the context, is, when Jesus is telling Peter has just declared in Matthew 16 that Jesus is the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to Peter, you're on, this is, you're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And then he goes on and he says that, but the Son of Man will go and suffer and die and rise again. And Peter says, no, right? No, this, far be this from you. This should not be the case, right? And Jesus says famously, get behind me, Satan. Well, in many ways, I think Peter is there. He's trying to do the best he can, but he has bad theology, right? His theology at that point is that, well, the Messiah ought to conquer. The Messiah ought not to be conquered. How hard is that? What's the point of having a king if the king gets killed immediately? Well, that's not very useful. So he thinks, wait a second, the theology is that God doesn't want us to suffer. God wants us to thrive. You're like, oh. And then, of course, it's interesting. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. And turns out that's like, it's Satan in the garden who says, you will not die. Right. He offers the lie that you will not suffer. And so in a way, what's Peter doing there? Peter has bad theology. And so Jesus says to him, no. And we think about how often it is that we kind of think, well, if we do the right thing, we shouldn't suffer. If we really love God, we shouldn't suffer. And God is saying, look at my son, look at my mother, look at my apostles. My promise to you is not that I will prevent you from suffering, but that I will bring glory through your suffering.
Yeah. And I think the point that can be missed in that is that God cares more than we give him credit for caring about what we do with our lives. Lewis uses the phrase in The Weight of Glory that we are half-hearted creatures, that we often set our sights so tragically low compared to what God, the kind of flourishing that God wants for us. And I phrase it often as the prevalent false theology is God doesn't care that. God doesn't care that I drink too much, or God doesn't care that I don't go to church, or God doesn't care about this or that moral question. And that's one of the most poisonous forms of bad theology. It's not that God wishes to arbitrarily control us. He cares to guide us into flourishing. And one of the things the Catholic Theology Show does, I think, is it gives people, and so many people mention to me, oh, did you hear Dr. Dauphinais' episode this week? They get excited about it. I think the show is responding to that hunger in the human heart that doesn't really want a God doesn't care that theology, but it needs to be guided to show us what it is that God does care about and how it leads us to flourishing.
Yeah, right. Because if God doesn't care about, what I do on a Saturday night or whatever, then it means God doesn't care what happens to me on Saturday night. Yeah. And that's pretty lonely and miserable. It was interesting. I was talking to some students today, and I was telling them that we were going to be doing this. We were going to be taping a 3rd-year anniversary of the Catholic Theology Show. And, I was asking, what are some things you'd like to hear about? And one of the things they said is that there's a class I teach on campus called Love, Friendship, and the Future of Being Human. And they said that the themes in that course were so helpful to them. And I was kind of thinking in some ways, so in that class, we really deal with just the crisis in the contemporary culture. Why is it now that we're having life expectancy has gone down in America in the last 5 years, started before COVID? We now have a lot of deaths of despair. We have deaths of drug overdoses. We have deaths of, young people are more likely to harm. They're the less likely to be killed by a stranger, but they're more likely to be to have their life ended by themselves. I mean, this is an epidemic of suicidality. We have really kind of a pandemic of loneliness. There was the British BBC did a study on loneliness and found out that young people are the loneliest, right? 16 to 24-year-olds. This is young people that ought to be kind of, connecting, and their social connections are they're so necessary. And this is a problem in a way that goes back to the garden. It goes back to our losing our communion with God in the garden and our communion with one another. But it's also something that I really think is just, we have a problem right now. Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Anxious Generation, really shows that since the advent and the ubiquitous adoption of the cell phone, people have not gotten happier. They've gotten more estranged. They've gotten angrier. They've gotten lonelier. They've gotten more fearful, more anxious. 24 news cycle, the 24 social cycle, 24/7. I go to bed thinking about what are people thinking about me, or I go to bed thinking about what are other people thinking. This is not a way to live. And so we really have to recover a deep sense of God has a plan. Because I think in a lot of this, what we've done is we are so attentive to the things of the earth and to our earthly surroundings, trying to orient ourselves, that even if we believe that God has a plan, we kind of forget that he really does, and we don't believe it in our hearts. And so we have to really find a way to recover that deep confidence that God has a plan, that God will bring good out of things, that this world is not all there is, that heaven is real, that what Jesus did on the cross is real, and that I can have joy and hope in it.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about the show and the word you just used, recovery? Really engaging these problems in a sense of recovery. So I know you well. I know that you have graduate degrees from Duke University and the University of Notre Dame, two of the finest universities in the world. I know that you are a very accomplished academic. You've written multiple books and countless articles. And most people who have your credentials and your background and your accomplishments wouldn't equate their academic work and vocation with the church's work of evangelization, but you seem so comfortable doing both things simultaneously. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about your professional life. You've been involved with the universities for the last 30 years of your life as a student, graduate student, administrator, professor, and we're celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the Catholic Theology Show. So how do those two things work and complement each other for you? And what would you say to the stereotypical academic who has prestigious credentials, who doesn't see the work of evangelization as relevant to the work of research or teaching?
Well, speaking for my own story, my own experience of this, I think that in part it goes back to really my own discovery of the faith, right? Is that I had absorbed the kind of cultural ideas about God as a child, that Christianity was somewhat superficial. The Christianity was this vague belief that God is nice and we should be nice, and if you're nice, God will be nice to you. And I experienced suffering as a child, as most people do. I had a cousin who died when I was 10. I had a sister who died when I was 13. And I also, other thing I was thinking about, that I remember watching National Geographic as a kid. But National Geographic and those science shows that I watched as a kid, they just kind of they had this atheistic paradox. We weren't looking at the glory of God. We were looking at creation as a way of saying there's really no God in the world. Man is a problem. The animals are wonderful. And I think animals are wonderful, by the way. This is wonderful. And the stars are wonderful. But the idea that why we would think that the stars aren't telling the glory of God. And so anyways, a lot of that is just to say that I experienced these cultural ideas that I began to think that the more I develop as a scientist, as I wanted to be an engineer, the more I develop in really rigorous logical thinking, the more I have to set aside my faith. And then I was also hit with this tremendous suffering. And so I just kind of rejected God. But when you reject God amidst suffering and amidst atheism, you're really stuck in a hole. You're stuck in a hole. And so for me, then discovering in a way that you could use reason to think well about God, that God has not left us alone, that he's given us human beings who love us, and that when we experience that love, we experience we do experience a little bit of the glory of God. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Human love tells the glory of God. I remember in my own conversion recognizing that there's certain things that are just true in the desire for goodness that just don't work. They don't make sense in a non-metaphysical horizon. So for me, I think I've always had an idea towards wanting to help shape the profession by doing the highest levels of academic work, writing books and writing articles that I know are only going to be read by a handful of other academics. But those academics teach so many. And if graduate students can read the works that we're writing, then that can inspire their writing. When we can organize conferences, we can try to impact another generation of younger professors, older professors, doctoral students. And through doing so, you can kind of the intellectual apostolate of helping people recover this kind of truth that the academic study of theology need not separate us from the truth of what we're studying. And so with that tendency, though, then I think it was always just natural for me to, at the same time, have a big heart for teaching. I think I always kind of seen it's really all just absorbing of recognizing my own confused, especially younger, but, continued, my own confused ideas that often it's like somebody has that expression like your first thought is wrong. Well, I often think our intuitive thinking is often just confused because we haven't really thought very carefully. So our first thought is often confused when we submit our thinking to the tradition, first through rigorous academic study, then wanting to help other academics and other theologians think through these matters more thoughtfully. But then also I've just always had a great heart for wanting to teach students and wanting to teach outside the classroom.
Yeah. I have come to the sense in wrestling with this question that sometimes we can forget that insofar as something is true, it's never merely academic. And so sometimes academics can be too isolationist in the important impact that their work can and should have when it's shared more broadly. So If you don't mind, I have a couple more questions. Can I ask you a really hard question?
Maybe, yeah.
So on the topic of the class that you've been teaching here at the university that's very popular, and the general topic of the post-cell phone crisis, what's the Michael Dauphinais 101 answer to that problem? I know you've studied it deeply and reflected on it for a long time, and a lot of the people who consume this program struggle themselves, but they're also parents and grandparents who are trying to help others.
Yeah, I think maybe three things I'll just say, and this is kind of the way I structure the class, which is first, we got to really think over the last 20, 30 years, something has happened and it's real and we better pay attention, right? There's something a little bit off. Phones are amazing and they're problematic. They are addictive. They are addictive processes. It's hard, when if you ever notice yourself reaching for your phone, whatever it is, maybe somebody texted you, maybe it was your grandchild, maybe it's, maybe you want to see what's on news. It's just, you never know what you're going to find. And so it's infinitely interesting. Even if it's boring, they know the intermittent reinforcement, occasionally finding something. If you scroll through 30 things and see one thing that's mildly of interest, it's more exciting. Right. And so I think we should have to recognize the phones are addictive. If you're not detoxing from your phones, you are intoxicating yourself. This is not something that some people struggle with. This is, if you are human, you have a proclivity, an inclination to develop a mild phone addiction. Right. This is just a fact. So I think if we're become aware of this, and we have to practice elements of regulating it. This is a part of our tradition. We have a strong inclination to eat and drink. And we have a very strong inclination on our own to eat and drink too much. So we really have to work at it. This is just a part of the tradition of the church. So, we should, if you're going to fast on Fridays from meat or offer some other sacrifice, well, fast on Fridays from maybe your phone, or at least, don't have it after 8 o'clock or don't have it before 8 o'clock. Whatever it is. But I feel like it's just, the key thing is to be aware of it. There's no magic bullet, but the key thing is if we're not aware, then we end up yielding our freedom. And I think this is just really important, and to begin to live that in our own lives. I also think that, so that's the first point, is just to be aware that we better be thoughtful and careful. And the other thing is, I think if the easiest technique I would suggest is don't even think about fasting, but just up the ante, up the ante, up the ante. What does that mean? Well, what I mean is that if you see something on your phone about somebody, don't like their social media post, text them, call them, right? If you see something of interest and you want to send it, call your dad, call your son, call a friend and say, oh, by the way, I was reading this and I thought of you. So could you mind if I send it to you, right? Don't be satisfied if you use the online to then move to a live connection with another person. That's what's satisfying, right? Otherwise, we think we're in connection, but we're actually not being, The second thing I would say is that this is an old problem. Human beings don't get along with each other because we're all prideful. As Lewis develops in his Voyage of the Dawn Treader, one of the characters becomes a dragon. And one of the things about dragons is you don't see many dragons together because dragons tend to eat one another, right? Well, of course, Lewis is really talking about us. We're all dragons. We all have the nature of sin in us. We're all dragons, either dragons or dragons in recovery. So it's actually hard to get along with other people. Part of the reason why we're lonely is because we're just not very good at making friends. We're not good at being friends, and other people aren't very good at being friends. We're just not very good at this. And we never were that good at it, right? Lewis writes this about Hamlet. So Hamlet, I think, comes out in around 1603. So this is 425 years ago. Shakespeare's writing this, but he says here, the characters they're all confused, they're lost. The characters, he writes, are all watching one another, forming theories about one another, listening, contriving, full of anxiety. The world of Hamlet is a world where one has lost one's way. Think about it, that's our modern news media, social media. The characters are all watching one another, forming theories about one another, listening, contriving, full of anxiety. The world of Hamlet is a world where one has lost one's way. So just remember, too, this is like, hey, this isn't really that new. There are certain things that are new that we need to really be careful about, recognizing the particular things. But remember, this is a longer problem. Right. And it goes all the way back to, 2,000 years ago when Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, the eye is the lamp of the body, Matthew 6:22, which is that the eye is the lamp of the body. And the eye, what do I look at? I really look at others. I want to see how they're looking at me. That's what Jesus says, right? When you fast, when you give alms, when you pray, we want to be seen. And that's how we judge we're okay. But he says, don't worry about being seen. If you worry about being seen, you've already gotten your reward. But worry about your Father who sees in secret. He will reward you. And so I think a lot of this is to try to genuinely recover a deep sense of trust in God's providence, right? That we are all in God's hands. Our loved ones, before they were our loved ones, before they were ours, they were in God's hands, and I put them back in your hands, Lord. Before I was mine, I was yours, Lord, and I put myself back in your hands. These situations that I see about maybe in the news media or social media that are distressing or concerning, Lord, I can't fix them. I put them into your hands. If you want me to do something useful, help me to figure that out. And so that's what I say is kind of the first thing is focus on, we do have a particular problem, right, of the cell phones. And I think we need to be attentive to it. Up the ante, always move one more direction of living conversation. Right? Second thing is, this is an old problem, right? Shakespeare talks about it, and it's certainly something that's been percolating in the modern era. But it's really the third thing is it just goes back. This is just what it means to be fallen and human, is that we have a hard time getting along with one another. And so we ought to remember that we need God's help.
Right.
Yeah.
I read the Rule of Benedict devotionally. It really touches me. And there's a passage, I think it's in number 66, that says, idleness is the enemy of the soul. And I think to your point, this is an old problem.
Yeah.
That line indicates that Benedict knew that human beings could regress into the kind of thing that we're suffering so deeply from today.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, too, is people think that sin is fun, and so that sin is going to be thrilling and exciting. But sin is actually often just, from the German, I think it's like Sünde. It's sundering. It's separating. Sin is actually sad saddening, and separating and isolating. So isolating, you could almost just say that is sin.
Yeah.
Sin is the separating, the sundering of selves. And so sin is saddening and separating. And so when we see a culture often overwhelmed with saddening and thing, we're just going to say, oh, that's what sin is. So sin isn't so much about being bad, it's being wounded. And just the problem is that we're wounding ourselves. And so we need to learn to think better about ourselves and think better about God, and to really understand that maybe God cares. Maybe God cares about us, and maybe God's plan is actually worth trying. Maybe, I think it was Chesterton who said that Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and not tried.
Yeah. And language today, in recognition of this, has become surprisingly acute in the context of wasting time through scrolling or the prevalence of pornography on the internet. You hear people using phrases like soul crushing a lot. Yeah. So there's a recognition, even if they're not quite sure what categories to put the problem in, the language does reveal that this crushing impact is something that is reverberating within them.
Yeah. And we're just not meant to have a natural vision.
Yeah.
If we have a natural vision, we'll just get that reward. Like, if we look at what others are doing and we want to be seen by others, we're forming theories about what others, Lewis says about Hamlet, we're going to be anxious. So we have to look up. That's what Jesus is saying, is you need a supernatural vision. You need to look at the Father with my eyes. Yeah. Right. And I think that's the beauty of really the good news.
So another question for you, and I've been on maybe a handful of episodes, and in all humility, as an administrator of the university, I see numbers related to the Catholic Theology Show, and my episodes are not merely as popular as some of the most popular episodes, which you have episodes that have received not thousands, but tens of thousands of views and downloads. But yet, even in my limited role on this program, I've had many people in Ave Maria, but even traveling, say that they listened to or saw me on the Catholic Theology Show. So I'm wondering, what has been a surprising or interesting interaction that you've had with someone who's reached out to you because of the Catholic Theology Show and it's touching them?
I do think it's actually fun to go through a few of the numbers. We do have something that on Apple Podcasts, this was about a month or so ago, but we have almost about 140,000 total listens. Spotify, over 90,000 listens. So that means on Apple and Spotify, we have over 230, almost 250,000 listens, which is kind of just, my mind is amazing. I always thought that if 50 people listen to each episode, I will keep doing it, because I'm happy to teach, 50 students at a time.
Right.
And so I thought this will be great. That was always what I had in focus. And we've had actually on YouTube, we have a bit more because you can do advertisements on YouTube. We have like 380,000 plays on YouTube.
That's remarkable.
And one of the things actually was really encouraging to me was when I looked at the numbers for August 2025, we had our highest month on Apple and Spotify. So that means for that month, we had about 6,500 downloads on each one. So the large thing, that was really, because you don't know when you do something like this, whether or not people will want to listen. And if they want to listen, will they keep listening?
Right.
And I think I'm just so grateful to the viewers. And I really want to thank you. Thank you to all the viewers and listeners who have really, just kind of found something worth listening to and continued to do it. And definitely want to help and hope that people at Ave Maria or, affiliated with the university, alums, parents will do it. But I've met people, Oliver, it was actually funny. I was there was somebody from Mexico who was at a conference that I was at in D.C. and he's a Catholic student at a university in Mexico, and he listens to the show. And it's just really amazing how that happens, where it's kind of just a gift. I don't know how to put it. It's like, I feel like being a teacher is one of the most kind of treasured and amazing opportunities as just a profession, to be able to have that ability to share with others things that I have struggled for decades to try to understand and learn, and to be able to share a little bit of that with them is a real gift. And so to be able to do that online in this virtual podcast environment has been a real joy.
Right. I bet people are curious how you think about and plan and plot the Catholic Theology Show, because you have a lot of really amazing guests on a lot of different topics. So it's really surprising week to week when you see the new episodes come out, the kinds of things that you've been working on. And how do you arrive at the guests who come on the show, and how do you plan this and think about your work?
Yeah. I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and take a 30-minute break. That'd be a long time. 30-second break, and we'll come back and I'll answer that.
Good.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support. And now, let's get back to the show.
Roger was asking me about how do I plan the episodes? And, it's interesting. In some ways, it's like when I teach, you teach a couple hours a week. I don't know, we teach, we have classes that meet 2 or 3 days a week. They meet for 3 or 4 hours, maybe like 4 or 5 hours a week, most classes. But I think about the class kind of all the time, right? I'm just always thinking about what could I do to improve the material that I'm going through? What could I do to improve? What would be another way to try to communicate this idea? Oh, this is coming up. And so I just think about it in some ways 24/7. So in some ways, the Catholic Theology Show is like that. I just am constantly thinking about what could I do that might be effective in trying to teach my audience, which I think about the parents of Ave students. I think about just people that are interested, maybe curious about the Catholic faith, maybe alums. It's fun. I've had some alums who have come up who say they listened to the show and they might have graduated 10 years ago. And so I think about what could I do? And so I like to kind of try to rotate through themes, make sure it gets kind of like a biblical episode, occasionally dealing with Aquinas, occasionally dealing with Lewis, but especially drawing on, great books. I think one of the images that kind of captivates me is that there's such a magical moment that happens in a classroom, right? But you just can't share it with that many people.
Right.
I remember we just met some students. Then they had graduated from Ave Maria in the early days, and one of their favorite professors was Dr. Reardon. And they now are sending their 2 oldest kids to Ave Maria as freshmen this year. And they actually own a horse ranch, right, somewhere up in Northern Virginia. And they named one of their fields Reardon Field, right?
That's
now.
remarkable.
But so that's just something so what happened in that classroom? Who knows? But it's kind of special in a way, because you have, in a way, Dr. Reardon, who spends his whole life trying to study stuff. And so what he's teaching in that class is the fruit of his life. But so few people can take that class. So one of the things that was great is, hey, I had an episode with Dr. Reardon, right? And so I try to think about wait a second, these are classes where professors have been, you've taught the sacraments many times. And so if we can have it where we were able to have an episode of the sacraments, and you can do that. And so kind of opening up a window onto the magic of a classroom, right? And the beautiful thing is it's also, in some ways, when you take a whole class and you condense it into 55 minutes, it kind of is a magic. It is magic. Sometimes when the course is actually spread out over a semester, there are times that are less magical in it, right? It does, semesters can get long, professors can get confused, or it can drag out, and some things work better than others. So I feel like that's a really beautiful thing. So I like to kind of think, what are people that have taught things for decades? And how can I communicate that to the people? And then the other thing are, what are great books? Again, a lot of times if somebody's written a book, it may take a year or two to write a book, but it's probably taken 10 years to think about that book.
Yeah.
And so when I love getting authors on the show, both maybe from Ave, but also from all across the country and even internationally, because a lot of times it's like professors have thought about a book, as I said, for 10 years. They've worked on it for a couple of years. Or even if the book is popular, people still put their blood, sweat, and tears into that book. And sometimes you don't have the time to read all those books. Or even if you did, I don't know. It's like you don't quite, you haven't been where the author's been, so you don't quite understand what the author's trying to say. And so when you can have that time where the author opens up and says, wait a second, I actually, studying Catholic theology has changed my life. It's changed how I think, and it's changed how I live. It's changed how I suffer, right? And I've tried to communicate a part of that in this book I've written. And I think it's a real gift for me to be able to share that with the audience. So those are kind of my two favorite things are either courses that people have taught or books people have written. And then the other thing is I love reading and teaching great books. So I love bringing in conversations about great books. I think we're doing an episode, or we're doing a series on the great book, the Summa Theologiae of Thomas Aquinas. We've done episodes on a lot of Tolkien's writings, a lot of C.S. Lewis's works. We've done, episodes on different books of the Bible and different things like that. So I love that as well.
Yeah. I liked what you said about sharing the magic of the classroom. I know that the university is very proud of the Catholic Theology Show podcast and very grateful to you for all of the work that you put into it. But I've also felt strongly that Catholic universities should try to make some of what they do available as a resource to those who can't be on campus, who can't take the classes. And as I follow the episodes, I think people get a taste of that from you. But then also many of the guests that you have are professors, and many of the guests who you have who are not professors are visitors to the university. So it's a way of people sampling life at Ave Maria University and you sharing it with them.
Yeah. And I think, and in some ways too, they talk in sometimes like in marketing, what you want to have is the ideal customer, the ideal audience, the ideal listener or student. There might be thousands of listeners that are completely different, but you kind of have to, when I'm communicating, I'm enjoying conversing with the person and really just trying to kind of, just to get, it's humbling. I mean, I don't know how to put it. It's like every guest I feel like is my favorite guest because, and this is something I've also shared with people, but I want to share now is that so often when you meet someone, you have a friend who's a theologian or a friend who's just an amazing Catholic, Catholic intellectual or Catholic, just they're a leader in the field or they've done amazing things. They're just they're very effective in the apostolate. And yet you get together and you talk and kind of what do you talk about? Well, you talk about the weather. Maybe you talk a little bit about politics. You talk a little bit about different stuff. And it's kind of like but you often don't get to say, what is it? What is the truth that you're seeing? What are some of the truths about the reality of God and his plan for our salvation in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit, through the church? What are some things that you've seen and discovered lately? And it's kind of difficult sometimes to have that kind of intimate conversation about truth and meaning and purpose with other people. And so the beautiful thing I find is that when I get to have people on the show, I get to ask them those questions. And so I feel like I have the best hour-long conversations with friends. And if I was friends with them before, I've deepened that friendship. And if not, I've begun that friendship.
I think it's a gift. That's certainly how it comes off to those of us who enjoy watching the show. By the way, how did you come up with the title, The Catholic Theology Show? Why didn't you call it Minutes with Michael or something like that?
It really goes back to the idea of I'm going to tell you a little bit of just the story of how I got involved in the podcast. So about 4 years ago, about a year before we launched this, I was really just kind of struck by the fact that We have a good theology faculty here. I have done a lot of writing academically. I've done a lot of teaching. I'm an effective teacher. I love teaching. Students respond well to my teaching, these sorts of things. But but we're not doing a lot to kind of communicate to, we're not doing anything to communicate online, and I was like, well, students are more and more, graduate students, younger students, other people are more and more learning, not through books, but through podcasts. And so I got I think it was an iPhone Pro, or 13 or something. I can't remember, about like 4 or 5 years ago, thinking like, maybe I'll start doing my own podcast. And I remember thinking, maybe I'll do my podcast. Maybe I could do this. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll do it on C.S. Lewis. I teach a class on C.S. Lewis. It's popular. I know Lewis a lot. You could probably do a podcast on Lewis. Maybe I'll do something on Thomas. I love St. Thomas. You can always do stuff on Thomas. I love the Bible. I'm like, I don't know. So I kept just kind of wandering back in this planning phase, but I was never quite ready to pull the trigger and decide something. And then we had a new president at Ave. We had a new marketing team, and they said kind of like, well, we have to do stuff to get Ave Maria better known, or to get the theology department here better known. And I said, kind of like, well, I've been thinking about this idea of starting a podcast, and they said, let's do it. So then they were willing to support me in developing this podcast, which was great. And that kind of gave me the confidence that it was worth doing. And then in doing it, we discovered that it's really best just to, what really matters, what the heart of it isn't particularly studying Lewis. I don't love Lewis because I love Lewis. I love Lewis because Lewis opens up the door for me of the faith, because I love Jesus Christ and I love God and I love what God has done and the way that God has communicated himself through scriptures, and then through the reception of scriptures through the fathers, through the medievals, through St. Thomas, and through all the way down through our contemporary age. And so I realized that in some ways, this has to be kind of a more generalist account. And, one thing that was funny is I think it was like a week before, it was like a month before that we were going to start doing the recordings. I still hadn't decided whether or not it was just going to be me doing the podcasts or whether or not it was going to be guests. And one of my sons, who listens to a fair amount of podcasts and had listened to some very popular ones that are very, well known in America, just said, Dad, it'll be a lot easier if you interview guests, because then you won't have to prepare a 40-minute talk every time, but you can, you can just prepare and then you can develop it. And I was like, I hadn't thought about that. And then I was thinking well, also, it's just so much easier for people to listen to a conversation than it is to listen to a monologue. Yeah. I have to be a very gifted orator to hold people's attention for 45 minutes, but a conversation is really natural. And I realized that's actually what I really love. And just one last thing that I wanted to mention is that, when I used to be recorded, or when they would need to do a video, let's do a video for Ave Maria, talk about being a dean, talk about the liberal arts, talk about Aquinas, I would always get very tongue-tied in front of a camera. Even the first time I was on a bunch of podcasts to do when we did our book with Word on Fire academic, Matthew Levering and I, called Wisdom of the Word, Biblical Answers to Pressing Questions about Catholicism. And it was on about 10 podcasts. And I found when I was the guest, I got kind of nervous. And it wasn't really, I was very comfortable in the classroom, but I wasn't comfortable in front of a camera, behind a microphone. And so I thought about it, and I was just thinking that, what? I think a podcast conversation allows me to both be a teacher, but also a learner, and to help other people having been a guest and sometimes felt awkward. I feel like one of the things I really enjoy doing is trying to make guests feel very comfortable. Right. I try not to merely just ask one question, or a one-sentence question and then another one-sentence question, but I try to let it be a conversation where we're exploring ideas. So, that I feel like there's always something that I do a lot of preparation for each episode, but at the same time, I always learn something during the episode.
Okay. I have secret knowledge that you're working on a few things. I'm excited that there's going to be a multi-part series on Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae that you'll release at some time in the future. So maybe you could just share a little bit about what's next. Will there be new flavors to the Catholic Theology Show, or do you have any things you've been thinking about that you're going to, add to the way you approach it?
Yeah. I definitely think that I will work hard at continuing to try to do the same. I definitely think that's my, one of my gifts is that once I'm good at doing something, I'm just good at really doing it for a long time, and it never gets old for me. Right. Every time I teach a course, I feel like I'm teaching it for the first time. Every time I teach C.S. Lewis, I've probably taught it like 15 times. I've taught Triune God a dozen times now. And every time I teach a course, I feel like I'm teaching it for the first time. So I think that I feel like the rhythm, the structure, the way we've set up the podcast, the sort of interviews we do, I think are working. And I want to continue that. I think that the newness is really just that it never gets old, right? Is you can continue to talk about the mysteries of the Trinity, the mysteries of Jesus Christ, the mysteries of the Creed, and they're always enlightening, and they're always new ways that we can kind of reflect upon them and draw in new scholars and authors. And then there's so many different ways that the truths of the faith are, that they've impacted history. Whether or not that's like the way I have an episode that I'm going to be recording soon on, John Paul II and the fall of communism. Ideas have consequences, right? And bad ideas have bad consequences, and good ideas have better consequences. I mean, in this world, good ideas often still don't. I mean, they still have limited good consequences because they never, bad ideas coexist alongside of them. But that's kind of a beautiful thing, and this question in a way of. I look at it as trying to kind of recover a little bit of the joy of learning. I think a lot of parents, a lot of older people, you'll meet people at conferences and they wish that they could have gone back, that they could go back and be a student again. There's that line, it's not true, but it says something, education is wasted on the young. And there is a way that I feel like just, in my 50s, I'm just beginning to have enough experience that I can now read great books and understand them. Right after 30 years of studying, 35 years of studying, I begin to have that sense that I think I'm just beginning to now be an effective student, right, and really learn. And so I just kind of try to encourage. I hope that that's what people will continue to, kind of see in or to hear and enjoy in the podcast.
I like what you said about learning through conversation and how, from that perspective, every guest is your favorite guest because you get to have these great conversations. Yep. Was there something that you learned in an episode that surprised you or that you didn't see coming that has kind of stuck with you?
I think that what I find kind of most amazing is that so many episodes at some point or other, whether or not you're dealing with an ethical question or a moral question or a doctrinal question or a liturgical question, at some point it gets down to that kind of, there's that story of humility. There's some aspect of a story of suffering that we have to surrender. We have to surrender as creatures who are prideful to the Creator and somehow have to accept suffering. We have to accept kind of revelation. We have to accept kind of God's plan and just accept it. And then from that, discover meaning and purpose. And I know that sounds very, vague, but I find it just fascinating that it so many episodes, the question of accepting suffering and finding meaning in that, and that God's plan is often, right, the most meaningful. It's the most hopeful. It's the most encouraging. right? Even if it doesn't appear so at first. So, the church's teaching at first appear to be strict and harsh, and yet it turns out it's the church, and in a way, the church alone, that safeguards the God of mercy.
Right.
Right. I love that line from Exodus 34:6, when God appears to Moses and God says, "Look, I'm going to pass by you," and He says, "I am the Lord, the Lord." But then He says, "I am the Lord, a God," right? Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Right? Who is God? God is, right, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, right? And I just think that's something I find, that there's always a message of hope.
Right, right. It is a tremendous consolation to hear you say that. Also, I would say a hard lesson to learn. So I'm glad that we are able to turn to the Catholic Theology Show, because it's not the kind of thing that sinks in very easily.
No, I don't think it does. And I think that, we're slow learners. We really are. We just have to admit that. We're easily distracted. I enjoy playing golf, and one of the reasons why is because it reminds me I have the emotional maturity of a 4-year-old most of the time. And I just realized that that's probably one of the most wonderful gifts I could have, is just to realize I have the emotional maturity of a 4-year-old. And I think a lot of us, have the attention spans of 4-year-olds, right? We think about something for a few minutes a week, and then we think like, oh, that'll change something. But we really haven't let those truths kind of sift down to get into our head, but then to get to our heart, almost from our heart to our bones, so that, right? And this, I think, is the difference when we have to unlearn a lot of unhelpful ideas about ourselves and about God, and we have to allow these better ideas about God just to kind of like percolate in us. And I think if we do, we find a bit more joy, a bit more peace, right? We find these gifts, these fruits of the Holy Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, that Paul speaks about so eloquently in Galatians 5. And I think that's what we want to have. And often we discover that love, joy, peace by also just accepting and admitting that at times I'm actually more, resentful, sad, and irritable. But when I admit that, then I can say, wow, God, I obviously on my own am not generating a lot of love, joy, peace. So please give me these. So I just find somehow or other in almost every episode, there's some aspect where we rediscover the gospel, that on our own, our best efforts turn out to be wanting. And we can rediscover, there's a line that I love from Catechesis Tradendae, which Father John Riccardo talked about on the podcast, from John Paul II. But he says, right, the gospel is the initial ardent proclamation by which a person is one day overwhelmed and brought to a decision to entrust himself to Jesus Christ by faith. And so what I find is that somewhere in the midst of every conversation, there's a little bit of that moment where we begin to recognize that, wow, on our own, this isn't going to quite work, and we really need the gift of God in Jesus Christ. And yet we are free, so we can make a decision to entrust ourselves or a decision to re-entrust ourselves by faith to Jesus Christ.
Yeah. What a tremendous gift to be overwhelmed by the love of God, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of our books was called that Matthew Levering and I did. And actually, I think you were on one of our first episodes of the Catholic Theology Show interviewing me for the introduction we did to St. Thomas Aquinas called Knowing the Love of Christ, because I think it was its 20th anniversary.
That's right.
It might have been in the fall of 22. It was one of those. It was relatively
22 or 23. It was early.
Okay. Yeah, it was early. And but Ephesians 3:19 says, and I brought it here just to make sure, it's that to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with the fullness of God. And I definitely think if I had to have like a verse for the Catholic Theology Show, it's Ephesians 3:19. To know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. So we know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. So yes, it surpasses knowledge, but we're not going to know that love and know that it surpasses knowledge unless we utilize our reasoning and intellects to ponder these mysteries. And somehow by knowing that, Paul says that we will be filled with the fullness of God. And that means to slowly empty myself, of myself. Empty myself of my ego, the ego that ego edges God out of the picture, and slowly let God back in.
I know one of the things that those of us who watch or listen to the Catholic Theology Show really enjoy is the way that you wrap up each episode by asking guests personal questions.
It's my favorite part.
I had the privilege of asking you these questions 2 or 3 years ago when we did the 20th anniversary episode on knowing the love of Christ, but I suspect your listeners would like to hear updated answers to those questions. So correct me, of course, if I get the questions wrong, but I think the first one is along the lines of, what is a book you are currently reading?
I'm reading a book right now by, I think it's Francis Bauer, B-A-U-R, called Frequent Confession. And it's really fascinating because, I've been going confession off and on. I think I went to my first confession when I was 7. It was my last confession until I was 19. But at 19, I did come back. I think it was 20. I'm trying to think. I went to confession again in the fall of, I was 20. So it was right before it was a little bit before I got confirmed. I went back to confession. So I've been going to confession for many years. But this book has really been illuminating on really trying to think of how do you go to frequent confession and really focus on growth. And one of the things that's interesting, he really focuses on ideas like find a particular sin that you're sick of repeating. And he says, strive energetically. Really focus on that one and just ask God to overcome it. And it just, anyway, it's been really encouraging to have that sense of hope, that with God's help, we might make progress in overcoming some of our defects.
Yeah. I think that's such an important lesson to share with everyone, that sometimes the struggles that we have are lifelong or take years and years and years, but you can also step back and take inventory and see that God's grace does help us make progress. And what I like about what you just said is if we approached the sacrament of confession in that way, I bet over the course of time, we would be able to see that God is helping us overcome weaknesses and vulnerabilities.
And there's also just something to the fact, you can go to confession for 30 years and I still feel like I don't do it very well.
Right.
That's still it's kind of encouraging in some sense.
Right. And I think the second question is, what is a daily spiritual practice that you derive benefit from?
What I find probably one of my favorite times of the day is I get up in the morning, I get up early, everything's dark, everything's quiet. I get my coffee and I sit down with the gospel and a spiritual book and a cup of coffee, and I have quiet time, with our Lord. I have just that, and I think it's just a helpful thing. I've actually even found that a lot of people do examinations of conscience at night, and I kind of do a quick one at night, but I find I'm just so exhausted and I don't think that well. And so actually one of the things I've started doing is in the mornings, I actually then kind of at that time write down a list of, okay, what did I do well? What am I grateful for? Write down a little gratitude list, and then write down, okay, what did I not do well? What were some things that I can see clearly now that, and then, what do I need help with? And so I found that as kind of a little, a fun thing of a lot of people don't do or people don't talk about, but kind of bringing our examination of conscience into the next morning. I mean, not that we don't, before we go to bed, we want to, tell our Lord we love him and that we're sorry and we need his help. That's beautiful. But also in the next morning is a great time.
Yeah. Just this week, a couple of students have asked me a different variation of the question, how do you feed your prayer by persevering on the one hand versus not banging your head against the wall by wrestling with something that isn't fruitful? So in this daily prayer that you have, how do you decide what scripture or prayer book you're going to use? And do you have a criteria of discernment about what the Lord is leading you to? Or if something isn't fruitful, are you the kind of person that will put it down and use something else? Or do you think we should persevere through?
Well, I'm definitely okay with switching books halfway through. I have no problem with that. I think it's good to, to get what you can out of the books and then grow from them. I have a spiritual, I receive spiritual direction, through Opus Dei. So I definitely try to follow, their suggestions. Often a lot of their books are published with Scepter Press. It was actually interesting. I was reading I think it was some letters that were written by St. Josemaria Escriva, who was the founder of Opus Dei. And it was fascinating. So he's reading these letters in 73. So just 2 years before he dies, he's older. He's kind of lived a great life. He's well known, and everything. And he says something. He goes like, I got to let you know, like he basically tells you like, I did my Thanksgiving today after Mass, but I don't know how to thank God. I still don't know what to say to God when I'm thanking God after Mass. So this is a saint who founded Opus Dei, who's canonized in 2002. I was able to be there with my wife. But it's like he's sharing that he doesn't know how to thank God after Mass. And so I think sometimes just recognizing we're not supposed to figure out prayer. Prayer is really a moment of surrender. It's a moment of I'm fundamentally declaring my incompetence at being human before God and saying, God, please help me to learn how to be what I can't be, because somehow what ought to be natural to me is perplexing. So I really think that's an important theme. And I've also gotten to that idea that really prayer is just a surrender. Prayer is saying, I'm going to be rest for 20 minutes or 15 or 30 minutes or whatever. And I'm going to just say, I can't really fix the universe for right now. So I'm going to just be here. And I'm going to try to get my mind. I'm going to maybe think through what are some things I'm not doing well? What are some other people I can pray for? What are some readings I can do either in Scripture, the Psalms? I love the Psalms, or again in spiritual books that can help me just kind of open up my horizon, so I get out of the old man, the ego, and put on the new.
Yeah. Okay. And the last question, I think, is what is a false idea that you had about God, or maybe it's a Catholic teaching, and how did you overcome it?
So this is a kind of a deep one, a personal one. It may not make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but it's true. So I'll share it. I think a while after my conversion, I think I had a certain sense that my job was to be God's quarterback. It was to run off to the sidelines, get the instructions, and then go out on the field and run the field, right? Run the university or, as dean, run the department as chair, run my family as father, run my family of origin as son, and that I was God's quarterback. All right. And, I think there was a lot of joy in that, and a lot of willingness to try to do good things for God. And at the same time, I also look back and I kind of see there's still a lot of, there's a little desire to control. There's a little sense of pridefulness in that. A friend of mine once told me when I was going through a hard time with some children that, Michael, you can take the cape off. You're not Superman. And so I kind of feel like I'm not God's quarterback. I'm God's the quarterback. I'm like, I know that intellectually. Jesus is the quarterback. We got this, right? Jesus is the quarterback, but it's like you fall into the trap. And so I realized, I don't know, I'm the ball. Hopefully Jesus throws me somewhere useful. I don't do something stupid, but it's like footballs don't even bounce right. So I have a deep sense that yes, I want to show up, and yes, I want to try to be effective, and yes, I want to try to do the right thing and have courage to challenge things that need to be challenged and to challenge myself, but to do so with gentleness and humbleness. And so I think that idea of moving from being God's quarterback to letting Jesus be the quarterback and just playing whatever role he wants me to today, I think is really helpful, and trusting in a way that with my help, he will direct everyone else the way he wants to. And I can assist, but I don't have a cape. So when I take off the cape, stop being super dad, stop being God's quarterback, put the cape back on Jesus Christ. He's my savior. He's everybody else's savior. He's the quarterback. And I think that probably is the biggest truth I've discovered in studying theology.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Before we finish, I just want to say, both on behalf of the university and as one of the thousands and thousands of people who listen to the Catholic Theology Show. Thank you for this initiative and for the way that you pour yourself into it. It's a very fruitful apostolate in the church, and the impact is significant, and I'm very grateful for it.
Well, Roger Nutt, thank you so much, professor and provost of Ave Maria University, and a dear friend and colleague over many years, fellow co-director of the Aquinas Center for Theological Renewal. So glad to have you on the show. And it's been such an honor to be able to, you've been kind of a supporter of me throughout my time at the university, and also a supporter of the Catholic Theology Show. And I've really enjoyed that. And what a great opportunity to be able to celebrate 3 years of the Catholic Theology Show. As I said, we've had over, basically, I think if you consider Apple and Spotify, almost 230,000 listens. With the YouTube plays, I think we have 380,000. So anyway, together, if you put all that up there, that's over 500,000. So that's pretty amazing, and very grateful to all our guests, grateful to each and every listener. And as I said, I still go by the same thing. If 50 people listen to the show each week and find something meaningful, take a little maybe golden nugget, that an idea that they can wrestle with and begin to digest. And like all truth, we don't digest it, it digests us.
Right.
So glad to be here.
Congratulations and happy anniversary.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Roger. And thanks everybody for being on the show. And thank you so much, all of our viewers and listeners, for just all the growth and the encouragement for the Catholic Theology Show as we celebrate our 3rd anniversary. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.